Okay, so you decided your game system. You got your characters. You decided your backstory, your scenarios, your scenes. Now, moving on with your solo RPG, the next thing you have to decide on is when it comes to combat, your combat system. Now, typically, in I'm going to use Dungeons and Dragons as an example here. Each encounter and character has an armor class. Armor class is a designated number. You roll the d20 and you either add or subtract modifiers depending on the system you're using. And if it's equal or greater than the armor class, you do damage. And then at that point, you roll your weapons damage and it's subtracted from the hit points. That's one way to do it. And that's the way that D&D does it. Now, when you're playing a solo RPG, it's not very fun when you make characters and they constantly get killed. It's kind of discouraging. One thing that I found that I like to do, and I did pick up the 5th edition starter set and I read through it and it talked about it utilizing 2d20s. And it's something I kind of picked up and integrated into my solo RPG that I enjoy when I play D&D. And what I mean by that is when it comes to your characters, they're your characters. This is the whole entire reason why we have the storyline. I like to roll 2d20s and taking the highest d20. Now, some people would argue and say, well, this is cheating. Well, is it really cheating? You're playing a solo RPG. So essentially, it's you playing against an emulator or a spreadsheet that you created yourself with encounters, with percentages. I really don't view it that way. I view it as these are heroic characters. So, if there's a heroic quest that you were going to send somebody on, would you rather send Conan the Barbarian or Pee Wee Herman? You know what I mean? For those of you who don't know who Pee Wee Herman is, you can Google it. One other book I just recently picked up is called Dungeon World, and I just recently started reading and thumbing through this. So I really can't give you a whole lot. I got to the combat section of it that I thought was pretty cool, and I wanted to share with you. And one of the things they talk about in combat in here is utilizing set numbers on the d20. And you could integrate this into your game style and combat however you wanted to. So you could say, okay, 16 through 20, when you roll it, you do automatic damage to the monsters or your encounters, and you roll your damage. And we'll say a 1 through a 10, for example, would mean that at that point, the monsters would have the opportunity to attack you. There's one way of looking at that. And of course, that's up to you. I mean, you're playing the RPG solo, so you're going to have to modify some of them rules to be able to fit into your campaign and what you're doing. So there's a second way. The system that I really enjoy, and I really love the Battle Matrix, and that's Palladium Fantasy. And how that's set up is you roll your d20. Anything above a 5 hits your opponent. Now, your opponent has the option, as well as you do in an encounter, to be able to parry and dodge. Now, this is very unique because it gives you more options, especially when you play solo. And it adds more into the game. Unlike just being a standard battle matrix where it's just roll damage, roll damage, roll damage. This gives you more options and it opens up more doors for you. Because you get dodge, you get parry, and you get strike. Now, the other thing that I do like about Palladium that is really unique is in your Dungeons and Dragons, they don't really. I'm not going to say they don't because there are certain encounters and spells that do destroy armor. But in Palladium Fantasy, every piece of armor has what's called a structural damage capacity. So your armor actually takes the damage. And as that's depleted, your armor no longer offers you any protection. And at that point, your characters take damage. It's very unique because it adds more into the role playing game. What I mean by that is you really got to think because your equipment begins to break down. So you have to be careful at what you do. And it adds more into the RPG. Now that's for me with Palladium Fantasy, and I really enjoy them rules, and I kind of get a hybrid system that I use. I have great fun with it. And this is up to you to decide what you like. There are some games out there to utilize D6 battle matrices. And hey, that may be your cup of tea. And that's okay too. So, moving on from the battle to your terrain. What I mean by your terrain is when you play solo, you want to be able to have a lot of um, visuals. What I mean by visuals is you want to be able to see what you're doing in battle. If you're just sitting there imagining all this and writing it down, essentially you're writing a story. But to add into more into randomness, I use miniatures and battle grids. And what I mean by battle grids, one example I can show you right here, terrain like this. So when the miniature is actually on the terrain, you can see where the miniature is, and it's for movement, attack, lots of different things. Depending on the game system you're playing, they're pretty much all the same. Now, miniatures can be very expensive, and I've been into the gaming hobby for quite a while, so I've got a lot of money wrapped up to it that I've accumulated over the years, and I know other people that are the same way. It would cost you a nice chunk of change to dump all this money into this to be able to acquire all the things. So it's one of the processes you acquire over time, unless you know. Hey, everybody's budget's different, so if you would have the money, it's up to you. One thing I can suggest you, and where I got a lot of my miniatures from, was there's a system. It's no longer in print, and it's very. You can still find it, but you'll pay a lot of money for it. It's called HeroScape, and it was great. Came with all these miniatures. The battle terrain was kind of clunky because it was these large plastic pieces that you had to snap together, and it took up a lot of room. So, that it has pros and cons, I guess I should say. But there's one system that's out now. You can find it on Amazon. You can get it for like $14, and it's just right here called Magic the Gathering Planeswalkers. Now, what I mean by that, this is a game system, and if you're just getting into this, especially playing solo RPG, you're going to need miniatures. You don't need miniatures, but you'll probably want miniatures, is what I should say. And the one thing that is very cool about this is for $14, and I'm going to show you here, you get this amount of miniatures right here. And that's quite a few miniatures for $14. It really is. Now, that's one route you can go. Another route that, if you have to do things on the cheap, you could look into is you could go to local toy stores for this. You can even order them offline. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I know with most people, they pretty much do a lot of their shopping online these days. Amazon, eBay, so on and so forth. You could look at like the little army guys that we all had when we were kids, but now they make knights, and they make monsters, and they make zombies, and they make skeletons, and they make everything you can think of underneath the sun. And you can get those relatively cheap for about anywhere from 10 to $20 to a big bucket of these things. And you can take those and you could use those on your game board to represent miniatures. That's another way you can do it. It's all about visualization and being able to see where your encounters are at and to help you. Now, one other way you can do it that Gary Gygax brought up in um, basic Dungeons and Dragons, and he also spoke about it in the advanced Dungeons and Dragons as well, and it works out very well. And I've used this when I have DM groups, and um, it works well for everybody. You could take 6-sided dice. Let's say you have 4 encounters, so you can take the one. I'm going to use Goblin for example. Number 2 Goblin. Number 3. Number 4. So on and so forth. So as this damage is dealt, and as you know where they're at on the game board, who's there, who's no longer there anymore, and it helps you, and it helps the game come alive to a certain extent because you actually can see what's happening as the combat is going or the encounter. There's another way you can go about doing it. You don't even need to purchase miniatures. You could sit down with some graph papers and paper and draw out miniatures. I mean, there's so much gaming stuff out there that you can utilize miniatures for. It's endless. So, one other thing with solo RPG, and you really have to have, is you have to have good visuals because you're doing this solo. I mean, you are doing this hobby to have fun. So, you want to be able to have lots of representations out there in the battle map to make it a game. Otherwise, like I said, you're just writing the story. That's all you're doing. So, moving on from there, we've covered miniatures. The next thing I want to talk about is how do we bring it all together? All together. We'll cover that.